Good evening and welcome to the show. I'm Shari Markson. We've got a great show tonight. The Biden administration has finally released its report into the origins of COVID-19, and it raises even more questions about what was going on in the Wuhan lab. I'm going to speak to the top Republican, Michael McCaul, in just a moment. And we'll go live to the UK to speak with the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Tom Tugendhat, as the fallout from Biden's horrific withdrawal from Afghanistan continues. The head of the general medicine from the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne is going to be on the show, and she has important information every parent needs to know about kids and vaccines. Plus, did Joe Biden fall asleep during a meeting with the Israeli Prime Minister? It certainly looks like it, and you can be the judge of that a little later in the show. But first tonight, Joe Biden's 90-day probe into the origins of COVID-19 was handed down yesterday, and it found a lab leak and human exposure to an infected animal are both plausible explanations for how the virus started. But the intelligence community is divided on how the virus began. 4 intelligence elements are leaning towards a natural origin, but only with low confidence. 1 intelligence agency had moderate confidence in a lab leak, and another 3 elements of the intelligence community couldn't say either way. Some favoured a natural origin, some favoured a lab origin, and some saw both hypotheses as equally likely. The fact that the intelligence agencies have not been able to find definitive evidence or come to a definitive conclusion after 18 months is underwhelming and a pretty poor effort. As the Wall Street Journal said, it makes you wonder why Americans are paying $85.8 billion a year for their spooks. Now, a very senior Five Eyes intelligence source has told me of this 90-day probe that the problem wasn't about the intelligence collection. The intelligence collection was good and there was plenty of it. The problem was in the analysis. The source told me there's a lot of circumstantial evidence to support a leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and yet there's no intelligence that points to natural occurrence. Yet the analysts say it's inconclusive because the evidence is mostly circumstantial. The evidence for a Wuhan lab leak is all circumstantial. Nonetheless, the intelligence community ultimately released this statement. After examining all available intelligence reporting and other information, the IC remains divided on the most likely origin of COVID-19. All agencies assess that 2 hypotheses are plausible: natural exposure to an infected animal and a laboratory-associated incident. Now, when you think about it, this is actually quite an extraordinary statement, because you've been told this entire time from most media outlets that a lab leak is a conspiracy. I mean, not at Sky or the Australian or the Daily Telegraph, of course. And we first reported that intelligence agencies suspected a lab leak in a front-page story, this front-page story, in April 2020. And this was not an opinion piece. This was a factual, straight news article revealing the intelligence agencies were investigating the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Yet the ABC, the Sydney Morning Herald and the Guardian told you this was either a conspiracy or was highly unlikely.
So how likely is it that the virus escaped from that Chinese lab? Well, in short, it's not. Why did the lab escape theory still dominate the story, especially when virus experts had dismissed it 3 days earlier in the Sydney Morning Herald?
COVID-19 did not come from lab.
Shari must have missed that bulletin. So, given all those expert doubts, was this sensational treatment really justified?
Batman! Exclusive!
We think not. We also think Markson should have told readers that almost every virus expert had dismissed the lab escape theory.
Dismissed the lab theory. It's clear now just how wrong that Media Watch report was. I always knew it was wrong, and now everybody knows it is wrong. But it wasn't just the ABC. The Guardian ran this piece headlined, "Ignore the conspiracy theories. Scientists know COVID-19 wasn't created in a lab." What a joke. And over at the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, Anthony Galloway and Sharon Grosh also poured cold water on the idea that the virus came from a lab. They reported that the scientists at the facility have strongly denied a connection to the pandemic. On Wednesday, it again said it did not have the technical capability to build a new virus, and suggestions it had accidentally released one had been pulled out of thin air. Oh, of course, let's believe the Chinese narrative and take their word for it, even after they'd covered up the entire outbreak, keeping the disease a secret from the world and instead of taking steps to stop it spreading globally. Never mind the fact that they had been engaged in gain-of-function research for years and absolutely did have and still do have the capability to build a chimeric virus. Then in another report, another Sydney Morning Herald report, Anthony Galloway and this time Eric Bagshaw were concerned that our reports could undermine Scott Morrison's attempts to ban wet markets. They wrote, "The Telegraph had been devoting attention to the theory since mid-March, when it began running stories suggesting some advice to the Australian government had suggested a Wuhan lab could have been the source." They wrote, "The emphasis was perplexing to senior members of the government and intelligence agencies. They were not sure who was encouraging the stories." Not sure who was encouraging the stories. Well, I can tell you the answer is no one. We decided this was an important topic to investigate. And this says a lot about how the Herald approaches its stories. They worry about what's helpful to the government when Morrison was trying to implement an international ban on wet markets, instead of worrying about what you deserve to know. There is no more important thing to investigate than why so many people have died globally. And by the way, these stories in the Herald were shared by all their senior journalists who thought it was brilliant reporting. But let's not forget the ABC's health guru, Norman Swan.
There have been concerns about how secure the Wuhan labs are, which has created fertile ground for allegations and even conspiracy theories.
Conspiracy theories, they love that term, don't they? This Biden intelligence report is deeply humiliating for all of these media outlets and journalists who inaccurately told you a lab leak was unlikely. Will these media outlets apologise for misleading Australians on such a grave matter as the origins of the virus, on why so many people have died globally? Of course they won't. What they told you was not only inaccurate, it was misinformation. And it promoted the line that China wanted out there, that this had just arisen naturally and China had nothing to do with it. It'll be interesting to see if the tech giants, will they hold the media outlets to account for this misinformation? That's unlikely too. The tech giants do not care about the truth, and that's not why they silence Sky News. They care about being politically correct. Remember, until May this year, Facebook was censoring anyone who suggested the virus may have been lab-created. And while everything we say and do at Sky is heavily scrutinised, the ABC and The Guardian literally get away with claiming something is a conspiracy when the opposite was true. According to Biden's intelligence probe, not only is this not a conspiracy theory, but a lab leak is just as plausible as the virus arising naturally. And remember, this is a statement produced by a heavily politicised community that was by and large campaigning to get rid of Donald Trump. The top Republican on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Michael McCaul, and he's also the former chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee, has closely examined the origins of the virus, and he produced a report on it just last month. I spoke to him about Biden's probe a little while ago. The unclassified summary that's just been released by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence shows the community remains divided on whether the virus emerged from a lab leak or naturally. What did you make of the intelligence probe, and particularly the claim by some agencies that this virus was probably not lab manipulated, when this is directly contradicted by so many scientists internationally?
Well, you know, my Origins of COVID-19 report that we issued. I know you've done an investigation. You have a book coming out. And to me, while we could never get a smoking gun without access to the database that was put offline in the middle of the night on September the 12th. There's so much circumstantial evidence and so much of a cover-up that you don't do unless you're trying to hide something, that I think empirically all roads lead to the lab. It was probably accidental leak. What's interesting, and I think, for your viewers in Australia, our intelligence community is not just one agency, it's multiple. I mean, there are many, many different parts of it. And so they didn't come to a unified conclusion, but many of them, and I can't go into detail which ones, but some of the more credible ones came out stating that they did think there was genetic manipulation, that it did not come from animals, and that it was leaked accidentally from the lab. And so we've asked the administration for that report. We've also asked for it to be declassified. And I've read the summary like you, it just came out today, and I look forward to reading the entire report. But suffice to say, Shari, I think you and I are on the right side of history.
You look back on these past 18 months and so many scientists and so many in the media ridiculed anyone. They insisted it was a conspiracy theory that the virus might have emerged from a laboratory. And yet here we are in August 2021, and the intelligence community said that this is a real possibility. This is a plausible scenario that it might have come from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So, Michael, this was never a conspiracy theory.
No, never. That was concocted by the PRC, the Chinese Communist Party, working with Peter Daszak, who had Echo Health, NIH grant at the lab. And they came to him. He's working with the bat lady, Dr. Shi, taking specimens 1,000 miles away from these labs of bats and genetically modifying them. That propaganda was, he was a pawn of the CCP to write the Lancet report, medical journal, trying to just say that this was a conspiracy theory that could ever come out of the lab. He got 24 virologists to sign it, so it gave him a lot of credibility. But as we're unraveling this today, it is very clear what was happening, that he was being manipulated, if not a complicit with the CCP. And when you look at the papers that we have studied, the medical research they were doing was gain of function research, was genetic manipulation of the coronavirus. To basically build a super SARS-like virus and genetically modify it in the hopes they could create this vaccine from a virus that they have created. Now we're dealing with a variant. It's mutating. It's done so much damage, and there's no accountability.
Do you think the anti-Trump force that clearly exists within the intelligence community may have politicized this issue in any way?
I can't speak to that. I do think, again, they were not unified. There were some of the more prominent parts of the, within the IC that believed that it was genetically modified. So that's a step forward. I'm going to continue to investigate and get information as much as I can. I like a lot of this to be declassified. I don't even know why this is political. This should be a scientific exercise, and we'll never probably know. Then one thing I agree with that they said was, we may never have the smoking gun until the Chinese Communist Party opens up their lab, which you and I know will never happen. But when you look at all the circumstantial evidence and all the cover-up that took place to hide what they did, and they had personally attacked you, they personally attacked me just today. With another propaganda piece. Obviously, what I had to say and what you have has gotten under their skin, and I think the truth hurts. And I think they know what happened. And that's why they went to such great lengths to cover it up in so many ways. And they know what happened. And shame is something in that culture that beyond everything else. And they are going to cover this up as long as they can. But I think we need to continue to tell the truth.
I just want to turn to this horrific situation in Afghanistan. If Biden continues to stand by his decision to withdraw by August 31st, how will it be logistically possible to rescue the remaining American citizens and the Afghans left behind? And do you think the withdrawal date should be extended?
Well, even the president's spokeswoman, Masaki, announced today that we probably couldn't get all out by August 31st. Every expert and top person in the administration I've talked to, including and also our NATO allies, all agree we cannot get them out by August 31st. So they will be left behind in enemy territory. And the interpreters and our partners who we had that commitment to will most likely be executed. I would say, you don't do an arbitrary deadline. You conduct it by the mission and let the military conduct the mission to bring all Americans home by whatever time frame they need. Unfortunately, we're at the mercy of the Taliban. At the airport, we have to rely on the Taliban for our perimeter, which is a sad state of affairs. I don't think we can trust them. And now even more extreme force ISIS-K is now at that airport. This is I got to tell you, it's probably one of the biggest foreign policy blunders, again, in my lifetime. And the sad thing is it could have been prevented. But now we have an unconditional surrender after 20 years of fighting the Taliban, unconditional surrender to the Taliban. And I think our veterans and I think our Five Eyes, Australia included, feel like abandoned. They question whether it was worth it. And think about this, Shari. They have more Black Hawk helicopters than Australia does, a Five Eye ally. They are so weaponized right now because we left all this hardware, all this equipment. We left the the biometrics on our Afghan partners that the Taliban now have, so they can go in and execute them. This has not been planned well, and it's going to, as I've said before, president's going to have blood on his hands.
Well, don't you think the Republicans bear some responsibility here as well? It was President Trump who made the deal to release thousands of terrorists in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I never agreed with this concept that we can negotiate with them. I think the thinking was at that time we had to make them part of the provisional government. But Shari, you think about it, they're at that time about 80,000. Now they're about 100,000 out of a country of 38 million people. But I will tell you that agreement, I've talked to Secretary Pompeo and National Security O'Brien, that it was conditions-based, and they were violating the terms of the condition by not cutting their ties to al-Qaeda. And when they did violate it, we would hit them. We would airstrike them. I just can't imagine President Trump sitting back and watching the surrender to the Taliban without taking actions. Remember, this is the same president that dropped the mother of all bombs on Afghanistan. I just don't think that's his DNA. I think this is really an attempt to shift the blame to others. He's tried to shift the blame to the Afghan army, who was abandoned by us, and their own president, President Ghani, abandoned them, to the intelligence community, who actually got it right, to our own armed forces. It's his decision, and he owns it.
And that was the top Republican on the United States House Foreign Affairs Committee, Michael McCaul. You can watch my longer interview with him about Afghanistan on the Sky News website later tonight or tomorrow. Now, as you know, I've paid very close attention to the topic of the origins of COVID-19 for a year and a half now, and my book goes into great detail about what happened in Wuhan, and of course you can order it on Amazon or Booktopia if you haven't already. But I'm also pleased to tell you tonight that we have made a documentary based on my book, and I've been working with the head of the Sky News documentary unit, Richard Andrews, and experienced producer Rebecca Letourneau. They're a terrific, highly experienced team. Our documentary will air on Monday, September 20 at 8 p.m. And there's one person I spoke to for it who had a fair bit to say on the topic.
We knew there was some sort of an outbreak.
There was a problem with the Chinese narrative.
Sky News Australia presents an explosive documentary.
You have
When did you first hear that there was a virus in Wuhan?
Where and how it got out.
We now know.
It was obvious.
In an Australian first, Donald Trump's exclusive interview.
Do you regret now not paying closer attention?
Sharry Markson's worldwide search for the truth.
Delve into this a bit more deeply. You're going to find some pretty strange things when you do.
Some of the people that were most involved disappeared.
They knew.
What really happened in Wuhan, 8 p.m. September 20 on Sky News Australia.
So I sat down with former President Donald Trump just over a week ago. Of course, as US President, he was privy to all of the evidence on Wuhan, and I cross-examined him about his knowledge of when and how COVID-19 emerged, as well as his claims surrounding the evidence for a lab leak early on. Now, the American official that you saw in that promo, that was John Ratcliffe. He was the United States Director of National Intelligence from 2020 to 2021. He oversaw the 18 intelligence agencies who just presented Joe Biden with that report. Ratcliffe is across every piece of top secret detail on the origins of COVID-19, and he was unbelievable to interview. And the English gentleman in that promo, who I also interviewed, is the former head of British intelligence, Sir Richard Dearlove. So that is something to look forward to in 3 weeks' time, September 20 at 8 p.m. Now to Afghanistan. The United States has launched airstrikes against ISIS targets in Afghanistan in retaliation for the Kabul airport terror attack. The suicide bombings killed more than 170 Afghans and 13 American soldiers. Among those who lost their lives was 23-year-old Nicole G. You can see her there holding a baby. Maxton Soviec, just 22 years old, also died, as did Riley McCollum, only 20. And Kareem Nikui, also just 20. These are all young, brave Americans with so much to live for and so much ahead of them. Kareem's father, Stephen, spoke of the heartbreaking moment the Marines visited his house and he learned his son had passed away.
As soon as I saw them turn the corner and saw it was 3 Marine suits, my life changed forever.
These were the first American deaths in Afghanistan in more than 18 months. We know Biden didn't see any of this coming. In fact, he said a Taliban takeover wouldn't happen.
The Taliban takeover of Afghanistan now inevitable?
No, it is not.
Your own intelligence community has assessed that the Afghan government will likely collapse.
That is not true.
Can you please clarify what they have told you about whether that will happen or not?
That is not true. They did not reach that conclusion.
The extent of the incompetence in the American withdrawal is staggering. Not only did Biden not anticipate the Taliban takeover, but the US left $85 billion worth of military equipment there, some 75,000 vehicles, 200 aeroplanes and helicopters, and 600,000 weapons. The Taliban, as Michael McCall just said, now has better military equipment than Australia. And it'll be used not just by the Taliban, but it could fall into the hands of other even more dangerous terrorists as well. And we could all become the victims. Yet the United States gave details of American soldiers and other citizens that they plan to evacuate to the Taliban, trusting them.
They've now given the names of these Americans to the bad guys. This is incomprehensible. It reminds me of when President Biden gave the identity of our cyber risk to the Russians, right? This is naivete of Wilsonian proportions.
This ridiculous notion that the Taliban is suddenly moderate is absurd. The former head of British forces in Afghanistan, Colonel Richard Camp, says there's a reason Biden is pushing this narrative that the Taliban is the enemy of ISIS-K.
There is a narrative that they are the bitter enemies of the Taliban and the Taliban are going to deal with them. And I think this narrative is intended to take the heat off Joe Biden for his effective empowerment of the Taliban.
And the reality is there are now two terrorist forces at play in Afghanistan, the barbaric Taliban, or elements of it, and ISIS-K. And now the White House is warning there will be more airstrikes, and the US is bracing for more terror attacks. You can just imagine the families of the US soldiers who are still now in Afghanistan. This withdrawal has been a spectacular failure. The American soldiers that had remained in Afghanistan before this were effectively a peacekeeping force, keeping the terrorists at bay and keeping the rest of the world safe. Now the Taliban has easily seized power with barely any objection from Biden, and the terrorists are stronger than ever, armed with their powerful American weapons. Coming up after the break, I'm going to interview Tom Tugendhat from the UK. He served in Afghanistan for 4 years, and we'll look at the advice on vaccines for children. Stay tuned. And joining me now to discuss the fallout from the withdrawal in Afghanistan is the chairman of the UK Foreign Affairs Committee, who also served in Afghanistan, Tom Tugendhat. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Sherry.
Looking at this withdrawal, the Republicans are saying that the key problem is that there were no conditions placed on the Taliban, and that now it is effectively going to be, Afghanistan will be a safe haven against terrorists. Do you think this could have been avoided? Is there anything that the Americans could have done to avoid this situation?
Well, I think there are three fundamental moments when the rug, if you like, was pulled from under our efforts and under the Afghan government's efforts in Afghanistan. The first was when President Obama set a timeline for withdrawal. And that effectively told the Afghan government to start thinking about a different future, one that didn't include us. It told Afghan military to start thinking about a different future, and one that didn't include us. The second moment was when the Trump administration negotiated with the Taliban behind the back of the Afghan government. I mean, can you imagine if a US administration had negotiated with the IRA behind the back of the UK government? I mean, we would have taken it, to say we'd have taken it badly is the understatement of the century. We would have gone apoplectic if they'd negotiated the release of people who'd killed British servicemen, but without even consulting the British government. But that's what they did. That's what the Trump administration did, I'm afraid, with the negotiations with the Taliban just recently. And then the third thing that just happened is, of course, the withdrawal. And there, the Biden administration, I'm afraid, I think made an appalling error. And I understand why they think they did it. They want to refocus their efforts on China and on technological disadvantages. But I think they're in a very, very weak position.
How disappointed is Whitehall, is the UK government, about how the United States has handled this? Okay, we've just lost Tom Tugendhat there, so we will try and get him back in a moment. But let's go now to the Director of General Medicine at the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne, Sarah McCall. Sarah, thank you very much for joining me tonight. The biggest topic in Australia at the moment is whether children need to be vaccinated before we can open up as a community. Should we open up when the adult population is at the 70% vaccination rates, or do you think we really need to wait until children have been vaccinated as well?
Well, thanks for having me on. Look, I think the first thing to acknowledge is that as of 2 days ago, there is a vaccine that ATAGI has approved or recommended as being safe and effective for children who are 12 and over. So I would absolutely encourage young people who are eligible to go and access that vaccine. We've previously only been able to access that vaccine for kids who had special medical conditions. That said, I'm very keen on the government prioritising the safe return of children to school, and I wouldn't want the lack of a vaccine for children to be preventing them from getting back to school, getting their education back on track, and improving their mental health and their social skills.
Look, there's been a lot of misinformation and there's quite a strong fear campaign out there at the moment. I know a lot of parents are very anxious because we are seeing more children in hospital this time around than during the first COVID wave last year. Tell us what the real situation is here. Is the Delta strain infecting children more seriously, or is it just as mild as the original COVID and this is just a situation that Delta is more infectious?
Yeah, we certainly think it is more infectious, and we think that it's infecting more children, and that potentially children are playing a bigger role in transmission than in previous strains of this virus. But reassuringly, we're not actually seeing children get more sick with this virus than with other strains of COVID. So COVID is it's a devastating illness in adults and particularly in the elderly, but in children, the vast majority do really well, and it's very unusual for children to get seriously sick with COVID.
And ultimately, you know, we've just had the advice that says children over the age of 12 can be vaccinated. Do you think we're ultimately going to see kids under 12 also being vaccinated? Is this the next step?
I certainly hope so. I've got 3 children and my eldest is 10, so they're not eligible yet. And I'd love them to be vaccinated, even though I know that it's unlikely to cause a significant illness in them. The studies for children 12 and under are ongoing overseas. We're expecting to see results somewhere around October, and paediatricians all around the world, I think, are waiting for that with great anticipation.
Yeah. Look, lastly, I want to ask you about this devastating story that was in the Sydney Morning Herald on the weekend, where you had a situation in Sydney where both parents were in different hospitals. They were suffering from COVID-19, and it was a father speaking about how his 6-month-old baby was being cared for in another hospital, and he was worried about who was going to rock the baby to sleep. Obviously, 6 months old at that point do need help getting to sleep. We've seen other reports from Tokyo and other places where the same situation is happening, and there's a lot of children who are being cared for by hospital staff because their parents are unwell. How is this physically playing out? You know, I know you're in Melbourne there, but how is this physically playing out in hospitals in Australia, and do we have the staff to care for children?
This is an absolutely devastating situation, and I won't downplay that. There are 2 wards at Westmead Hospital, is my understanding, both from the news report and from colleagues up there, that are dedicated to children who don't need to be in hospital, but there's no one to look after them because their parents are so sick with COVID. There's a similar situation at Sydney Children's, and we've had a small handful of children like that in Melbourne. It's absolutely devastating. The best way to protect your family is to get vaccinated yourself and vaccinate all household members as soon as they're eligible.
Sarah McNabb, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
For all of the hard work you're doing as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Now we've got Tom Tugendhat back in the UK, so we're going to go back to Afghanistan with Tom now. Tom, before I lost you, I was just asking how disappointed the UK government and Whitehall is in how the United States has handled this, and particularly its insistence on sticking to that withdrawal deadline.
Well, I think there's various things that have frankly left us a bit surprised. One was the withdrawal deadline, as you say. I mean, we were aware that it was coming, but it was stuck to despite conditions on the ground, which was unusual in military terms. And secondly, in how it was done. I mean, it was to withdraw from Bagram Air Base, which was effectively our open door, was a strong call, I think would be a polite way of putting it. And it's left quite a lot of us somewhat surprised. So this is a moment for all of us to reflect on what happened.
Tom, just in terms of, you know, where we go to from here, there are still so many American citizens and other allied citizens who are not yet out of Afghanistan. Kabul airport, there are fears that there could be another suicide bombing, another ISIS terror attack in the coming days. You know, what is the hope of getting everyone out?
Well, look, it's very difficult. I'm still in touch with a few people in Kabul and around the country, and people are increasingly scared, not unreasonably, that Taliban death squads are after them, and it's heartbreaking to hear their calls. And what many of us are trying to do is to look for ways in which they could possibly get out. But it's very difficult to know what those routes are, given that the Taliban now controls the country. They have checkpoints everywhere, and increasingly they have the identities of those people who worked with us, because the biometric data now is being exploited.
Well, and also because the data was given to them by the United States. Tom Tugendhat, thank you very much for joining me, and I apologise for the technical difficulties.
Thank you.
Joining me now, Liberal MP and former Ambassador to Israel, Dave Sharma, and Labor MP, Andrew Leigh. Thank you both very much for joining me. Look, I spoke at the top of the show about, and just then again with Tom, about just how monumentally Biden has failed in this withdrawal from Afghanistan. But Dave, you know, what is Australia's part in this? While we did get people out, our people out far ahead of the US, you know, we have committed to this fight over 20 years, and people will be asking now at this point, what was it for? Was it all worth it? The terrorists have taken over Afghanistan.
Look, I can understand people asking that question, and particularly veterans who've lost colleagues and the family of the 41 Australians that we had killed there, and many others that are dealing with issues from their service, their civilians and military. All I can say in comfort is, you know, all of those people we sent there, we had about 40,000 Australian personnel that rotated through Afghanistan. They all did everything we asked of them. They all served Australian national interests well. I'm not happy with how this has turned out. I think there was a very good case for the United States to retain a residual presence in Kabul and with Bagram Air Base and an air capability which they had, and I argued for that in public. But ultimately, of course, you know, we couldn't stay there once the United States made the decision to withdraw, and that's true for NATO countries as well. So I think now we've really got to focus on honouring the obligations to the people who worked for Australia during our 2-decade presence there, and getting out as many of those as we can, as we have over the last week. And we've evacuated almost 4,100 Afghans out of Kabul and brought them to safety.
Well, that's such a good point, because there are still reports of Australians who remain in Afghanistan, and yet the government, your government, has said that the mission is over. Andrew Leigh, you know, what do you think about this? What should we be doing? What is safe for the Australian government to do at this point to rescue those citizens who remain, or not just the citizens, but the people who have assisted Australia as well, the translators and others?
Sherry, I had a number of heartbreaking meetings with Hazara leaders in my electorate, desperately worried about the fate of family and friends stuck in Kabul, people who'd worked with Australians, or just people who were worried about being persecuted by the Taliban for their work as journalists, for having served in the Special Forces or in the Air Force. Labor had been warning for months that we needed to get people out more quickly, and so we were disappointed that there wasn't more movement of people out through May, April, June, July before it came to this. I spoke to in the Parliament about the 20-year commitment to Afghanistan. I think it is important we learn the lessons. And Dave is spot on in saying that this isn't about the work that our military people did, nor is it about the 41 people who laid down their lives for their country. But it is important that we have a thoughtful conversation about our role there. In the British Parliament, there's been calls for an independent inquiry, not only from Labor MPs, but from Conservatives. And you've spoken with Tom there. There's also the comments from Theresa May that this does reflect poorly on British foreign policy. It's only through learning the lessons of our engagement in Afghanistan that we can better engage with Afghanistan, but also improve the way in which we do peacekeeping in the future. Get more successes like Solomon Islands and East Timor, and fewer catastrophes such as Rwanda.
Yes. Dave Sharma, I want to turn to the dispute that's unfolding between some of the states, particularly WA and Queensland, and the federal government. Josh Frydenberg is putting pressure on the states to open up when the vaccinations reach that 70% or 80% level. WA Premier Mark McGowan is insisting he's not going to allow COVID into his state and infect his population. What do you think about this?
Well, I think this has got a way to play out yet, so I wouldn't and these are opening positions by some of the state premiers, so I wouldn't necessarily, I think their positions will evolve as their populations are more heavily vaccinated, and Western Australia and Queensland are moving more slowly through the vaccination programs than some of the other states. But obviously that means as more of the population gets vaccinated, their risk calculus will change. But I think it's quite important that we focus here on the Doherty Institute modelling, which was put to National Cabinet, has since been updated a number of times, and which all leaders agreed to, which recognises that once we reach a certain level of vaccination coverage amongst the eligible adult population, COVID-19, including the Delta variant, can begin to be treated more like a regular infectious disease, like the yearly flu. And the yearly flu, as the Doherty Institute makes clear, there's about, in a normal year of the flu, there's about 200,000 cases of the flu. There's about 600 deaths. Every death of those, every one of those is regrettable, of course, but we take a risk-based approach to how we manage that. We don't grind the economy to a halt to prevent the flu from breaking out. We need to take the same approach with COVID once it's safe to do so. And I think the key to that, once it's safe to do so, is to make sure that we've got 80% at least of the eligible adult population vaccinated.
Yes. Andrew Lee, if WA and Queensland insist on sticking to COVID zero, do you think there could be a situation where New South Wales should be allowed to open its international borders and people would be able to fly overseas but yet not see their family members in WA or Queensland?
Shari, I think the opening of the international border does need to be a national effort. But the real problem here is the pace of the vaccine rollout. Under the Morrison government's original timelines, 70 to 80% of the population were meant to have been vaccinated right now. But instead, we're sitting at 25%, which is way below where Canada is at 66%. Europe has more than half of its population fully vaccinated. America has more than half of its population fully vaccinated. And the government doesn't have a clear plan as to when teens will be vaccinated. I'm the father of 3 boys, 2 of them in the 12 to 15 age group. And I find it strange that Scott Morrison is essentially saying, well, don't worry about those kids for the purposes of the national plan. I would like to see more certainty as to when my boys and other teens in Australia will be vaccinated, given that we know that 1 in 30 teens who gets COVID ends up in hospital. Leaving teens out of the calculation is problematic. But of course, all this goes back to the fact that Scott Morrison didn't order enough vaccine. For a mere $1 billion in the middle of 2020, he could have gotten enough Pfizer to vaccinate the whole country. And if he'd done that, we would be in a very different position where we are now, where just New South Wales alone, the lockdown's costing $1 billion a week.
Yes, yeah. Look, the issue with the federal government delay on getting the vaccines is going to damage Scott Morrison severely and his prospects ahead of the next election. The question is, by then, the population will be 80% vaccinated in all likelihood, certainly 70%. The question is whether people will still hold that against him or whether they will have moved on and forgotten. Dave Sharma, Andrew Lee, thank you very much for your time this evening.
Thanks, Sherry.
Thanks, Sherry. Good to join you.
And after the break, security guards are set to patrol our beaches. Is this overkill? I'll discuss it with the panel. Stay tuned. Welcome back, and joining me now is in Perth is Executive Director at GT Communications and columnist at The Australian, Gemma Tognini, and Senior Writer at The Fin Review, Aaron Patrick. Now, this is a clip that is just going viral on the internet, and yet hardly any mainstream media outlets in the US are covering it. There is vision of Biden having a meeting with the new Israeli Prime Minister Bennett, and he appears to fall asleep. Now, there's a lot of discussion about this because his fingers seem to be moving a bit, but the consensus seems to be that he has fallen asleep. Some people are joking it was because the Israeli Prime Minister was too boring. Have a look at the vision.
And the beautiful story of the friendship between our two nations, the United States of America and the Jewish and democratic state of Israel.
I mean, Naftali Bennett sort of looks at the media to go, oh, are you guys noticing this? Gemma, how can a president fall asleep during such an important meeting with all the media there?
Well, how can a president stuff up the withdrawal from Afghanistan and embarrass his country in that way? I mean, Biden is a disaster. You can be the most hardcore Democrat on the face of the earth, but you still have to admit that by any and every metric, Biden is a disaster. And that's another example right there.
Aaron, what do you think?
Well, Sharon, if you watch the whole footage, it goes for about 8 minutes. And I think these things are actually meant to be short and sharp. And it looks like Biden is pretty attentive, but towards the end, his attention wanes. So I think the criticism is a touch unfair, because essentially he is getting bored out of his brain by the Israeli Prime Minister sitting there and making this speech. It is. You watch the whole thing and you can tell. And he responds.
So he's allowed to have a nap because the guy's boring. So he's allowed to seriously.
I would call it resting his eyes.
I'm sure there's far more boring world leaders than the new Australian Prime Minister, and he seemed quite animated there. I don't think there's any excuse for falling asleep in the Oval Office. Now, Josh Frydenberg is warning of a shadow pandemic of mental illness. The Weekend Australian revealed that more than 340 teenagers in Victoria had sought hospital treatment for mental illness. And then a report in the 9 newspapers today said that emergency department visits for self-harm and suicidal notions are up 31% for children and teenagers compared to last year. 17 people under the age of 18 are believed to have died by suicide in the first 6 months of this year in New South Wales, compared with 13 in the first half of 2019. I mean, Gemma, you know, our days are focused with recording how many people have died by COVID-19, but our young people taking their own lives because of depression from the lockdowns is extremely serious.
It is the most telling and compelling argument to get out of these lockdowns yesterday, Shari. And I am appalled that there's a cohort of the community, typically elites and the very, very wealthy, who are quite happy to lecture others from the safety of their mansions that lockdowns aren't hard enough and aren't going long enough. We are sacrificing, Shari, the well-being and the welfare of a generation for the inconvenience of having to understand what it looks like to live with COVID-19. This is a tremendous, tremendous crisis amongst that cohort, and incredibly disturbing in Victoria that the state government there has sought to keep those numbers secret and has sought today to extend lockdown and refuses to give Victorian families a plan to return their students to school. That government is culpable. Yeah. That government is dangerous.
Yeah, well, it's a situation in both New South Wales and Victoria. Aaron, you know, in New South Wales, we've seen the police really cracking down on young people. That's why the curfews in the West and Southwest were introduced to get young people off the street. But who's worried about their mental health?
Well, that's the thing. Also, we see these daily numbers of people who've died and been infected, and we see these horrific forecasts of deaths if you open it up. But at the same time, people don't say, well, what's the total years of life lost if a young person takes their life, or if someone in their middle age dies of cancer because they aren't getting treatment, they aren't getting their breast lump tested. So there's a whole range of other effects of the COVID lockdowns that we're not talking about while we're obsessed with one virus.
Yeah. Look, we've seen a news report today, Gemma, that security guards are going to patrol the major beaches in Sydney to stop people arriving if they're at capacity. There might not even be sunbaking or sitting allowed if the infection rates get higher. What do you think? Is this overreaction, or is this a necessary move?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's absolutely an overreaction. We know from New South Wales Health themselves that there hasn't been a single case of COVID-19 transmission outdoors. It's an overreaction. Being outdoors is safest. People need to be able to exercise. It's nonsense.
Yeah. Look, Aaron, we are out of time, so we'll have to get your view on whether sunbaking should be allowed next time. Aaron Patrick and Gemma Tognini, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks, Shari.
And thanks everyone for your company tonight. Remember, you can watch the full interview with Michael McCall online at the Sky News website, and you can read the full report and my analysis of the Joe Biden COVID Origins report in the Australian newspaper tomorrow. Chris Smith is up next.